Hey, it's Pastor Dudley Rutherford here at Godly Goosebumps. Thank you for listening to our next episode where we tell stories. And from these stories, we see how God works and moves in mysterious ways. Sometimes we just tell stories that have a point that we want to make, and we hope that you will give us a follow if you're not subscribing on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and be sure to hit that share button. And the more people can hear these stories, the better off I think our world will be. Amen? I think a lot about just each of our lives and how God calls us, and He calls us in different ways. And usually when God calls us, typically we don't say yes immediately. We're hesitant. We sometimes run in the opposite direction. That's what Jonah did. Sometimes it's just because we can't even hear Him calling us, but if we ever do hear His voice, we just come up with this long list of excuses of why God could never use someone like me. It's because we all see ourselves as being flawed. We know how frail we are. We know the mistakes we've made in our past, and none of us truly feel qualified. And I certainly feel that from time to time, and I think that a lot of you feel that way. Think of Moses. He was 80 years of age when God called him. I think you remember the story where he's there at the burning bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And God tells him to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. And God calls him to help lead the nation of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. And a lot of people don't realize he was 80 years of age. He was also a very meek man. He was a humble man. And he also, I think he had a problem with his speech. He was afraid. He couldn't speak well. And so he had a lot of excuses. And here's God calling him to lead maybe 1.5 million Hebrews out of bondage and make that trek over to the Holy Land. And I think Moses is a good example of someone who had a lot of reasons why God shouldn't call someone like him. And maybe that's you today. Maybe you feel like you've got too many, I know there's a phrase called a crackpot. You've got too many cracks there in that shell of your life that God could never use someone like you. But you are exactly who God chooses to use. I would venture to say the more perfect you are, the less God can use you. Because when you're perfect, you tend not to rely upon God. You tend to rely upon yourself. There's this beautiful fable, and this is our story today from China, that illustrates kind of what I'm trying to share here with you today. Once upon a time, there was an elderly Chinese woman who owned 2 large clay pots. And she would hang each pot on the end of a pole which she carried across her neck. And each day she would walk from her house down to the nearby stream to fetch water. She'd fill up both pots of water, full of water. She'd pick the pole up, put that back over her neck, and walk all the way back to her house. But the story goes that one of those pots had a crack in it, while the other pot was perfect and always delivered a full pot of water back at the house. At the end of this long walk back to where she lived, the cracked pot always arrived only half full because of the leak, because of the crack. Half the water had leaked out during the trek from the stream back to this lady's house. This happened for 2 years, happened every single day. Chinese woman arrived home with only 1.5 pots of water. One pot was full, the other that was cracked, only half of a pot of water. Of course, the perfect pot was proud. It had never lost a single drop of precious water. But the poor cracked pot was ashamed of its imperfection and was miserable. The cracked pot thought of itself as a complete failure. And one day, the cracked pot was so tired of failing that it spoke to the woman. The crackpot said, "I'm ashamed of myself because this crack in my side, this leak, causes water to flow out all the way back to your house. And whenever we get back to the house, I'm only half full of water, and I have failed you, and I'm sorry. And then the crackpot said, maybe you need to replace me with another pot that doesn't have this crack. The old woman smiled, and she said gently, did you notice that there are flowers on your side of the path, but not on the other pot side? She said, I've always known about your flaw, so I planted flower seeds on your side of the path. And every day for these past 2 years, as I've walked back, you have been watering those seeds. And for these last 2 years, I've been able to pick the flowers from that side of the path to decorate my table back home. Without you being just the way you are, there would have been no beautiful flowers to grace my home. And brothers and sisters, I just want you to know it's okay if you're a cracked pot, if you're not perfect. There's a value even in your brokenness. We like to throw things away when they're broken, but God in heaven, He cherishes broken things, broken people. God uses broken people. Jesus took the 5 loaves from the little boy and broke them, and then He multiplied them. And He wants to multiply your effectiveness. But He can only really do that if you're trusting in Him, in your brokenness. When Mary brought the alabaster box of perfume, it was only when it was broken that the fragrance filled the house. And when you are broken, the fragrance of Christ can be detected in your life if you're trusting in Him. Jesus, if you remember, even said, this is my body which is broken for you. His body was broken on that cross, and good came out of that. So broken down, cracked pots, you all need to rejoice here today. Especially if you're here and you truly think that God can't use someone like you. And you see all those failures. And again, our victory comes through what Jesus does through our lives. And God uses imperfect people. So you need to rejoice because God uses cracked pots so that He and He alone will get the glory. I remember my dad preaching a sermon called We're All a Bunch of Cracked Pots, and that was the gist of that sermon. It was Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 said these words. I want you to hear this as we kind of wrap up this podcast, this episode. But pay attention to these words. Paul said, so to keep me from becoming conceited, he said, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment him. Now, we don't know what that thorn was, but we know that it tormented Paul. And I don't know if you've ever had any health issues, but sometimes they nag you. In other words, they don't give up. They keep nagging you, and you end up living with this trial, this issue, whatever it is you're battling. But Paul says 3 times, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He said, I pleaded with the Lord. He'd get down on his knees and he would pray, Lord, take this thorn away from me. This thing that's bothering me, I want you to remove it. But the Lord said to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. And therefore, Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And that is why, for Christ's sake, he said, I delight in my weaknesses. I delight in insults. I delight in hardships. I delight in persecutions. I delight in difficulties. That's all in that text. And then he said these words, for when I'm weak, then I am strong. And it's not that he's strong in his own strength. He's saying that in his weakness, that's where God shows up the most. And when God shows up in your life, I don't care what you're going through today. And I know a lot of you today listening to this, and if it's not you, you know someone who's going through some trial. You're having problems in your home, problems in your marriage, problems at work, maybe problems with your children, problems with a friend. Maybe you go to church week after week. Maybe you've given up on church and you just think God could never use someone like me. And I want you to know that if you're here today and you're not what you should be, don't dwell with that thought. Know that God desires to work through people like you and people like me. And afterwards, as you look back over anything good that happens in your life, you're able to say, it's by God's grace. It's by God's grace that I'm even standing here today. It's by God's grace that I'm saved. It's by God's grace that I can do anything good. If you knew my life, if you knew my story, if you knew my testimony, you would understand that God redeemed you and He redeemed me, and He's the one that perfects us. And you'll always hear us talk about that verse in Philippians 1:6 that says that God, once He begins a good work, He will carry that on to completion. God, as long as you're living on this earth, God's going to be knocking off those rough edges. He's going to be shaping you. He's going to be molding you. And when you're at your worst, God will be at His best, and He'll be there. He never leaves you. He never forsakes you. And the main thing is that you get back up. If you've ever fallen, if you've ever struggled, is to always get back up and know that with God, you'll be given a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance. And He's been called the God of the second chance, but He's the God of the 1,000th chance. But you have to walk with Him and allow Him to come into your life. And all those areas of imperfection, all those areas of weakness, just know that at that moment, God will fill you with His grace and He will fill you with His mercy. And God will use you. You're just a vessel in His hand. You're just a vessel, a tool, an instrument in the hand of God. And you watch, God will do great things through your life as you turn and submit your life to Him. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. Again, I just want to encourage you again to hit that follow button and share this with as many people as you possibly can. And always be prepared as we drop the next episode. And I just want to say God bless you and thank you for joining us here today at Godly Goosebumps.